In early February 1978, the New England coast maintained its winter routine beneath a cold Atlantic sky. From the Connecticut shore through Rhode Island and Massachusetts up to the rocky harbors of Maine, the region operated under the steady conditions of a normal winter season. Temperatures held in the 20s and low 30s. Roadways carried their usual traffic. Rail lines ran on schedule between Boston, Providence, and the smaller cities along the corridor. The harbors of Gloucester, New Bedford, and Portland lay quiet, their fishing fleets secured against seasonal weather. Ice formed along pier pilings and in shallow coves where the water met stone seawalls built decades earlier. Inland, the highways that connected Hartford, Worcester, and Manchester carried commuter traffic through landscapes of bare trees and frozen ground. Power lines strung between wooden poles supplied electricity to homes heated by oil furnaces and baseboard systems working steadily against the cold. Along the coast, the infrastructure sat exposed. Route 128 curved through marshland and low terrain south of Boston. Causeways connected barrier islands to the mainland across narrow stretches of tidal water. Coastal neighborhoods in Revere, Scituate, and Narragansett stood within sight of the Atlantic, protected by dunes and modest seawalls. Cities Boston, Providence, Worcester depended on road networks, rail connections, and electrical grids that had been expanded gradually over decades, their capacity calibrated to normal winter loads. On February 5th, the region functioned as it had through previous winters. Morning traffic moved along Interstate 95 and the Massachusetts Turnpike. Offices opened. Schools operated. The weather was cold but unremarkable. The forecast called for snow, a common occurrence in February. Nothing in the landscape or the schedule suggested interruption. The Atlantic remained gray and cold. The infrastructure held steady. The coast waited, routine and intact, as the first week of February continued without incident. The storm that would strike New England on February 6 developed from a convergence of atmospheric conditions that meteorologists observed but initially underestimated. A low-pressure system formed off the Carolina coast on February 5, drawing moisture from the warm Atlantic waters of the Gulf Stream. As it moved northward, it encountered a mass of Arctic air locked over New England by a high-pressure system positioned over southeastern Canada. This blocking pattern prevented the storm from moving inland or accelerating up the coast. Instead, the low intensified rapidly while remaining nearly stationary. The pressure gradient between the deepening coastal low and the inland high created wind fields that would sustain speeds of 40 to 60 miles per hour across the region, with gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour along exposed coastlines. The counterclockwise circulation around the low drew cold air from the northwest, even as it pulled moisture from the Atlantic, creating conditions for heavy snowfall. The storm's track placed it directly offshore of the most densely populated sections of the New England coast, maximizing its impact on transportation corridors and urban infrastructure. New England's infrastructure presented particular vulnerabilities. Elevated sections of Interstate 93 and Route 128 crossed open terrain with no windbreaks. Coastal rail lines ran within yards of the ocean along sections of the MBTA and Amtrak routes. The electrical grid relied on above-ground distribution systems, wooden poles carrying lines through residential neighborhoods and along rural roads. Seawalls protecting coastal communities varied in height and condition, many built in the early 20th century to standards that had not anticipated the combination of high tide, storm surge, and sustained wind. Weather forecasts on February 5 called for snow, but predictions underestimated both accumulation and duration. The National Weather Service issued winter storm warnings, but the full severity of the rapidly intensifying system was not communicated effectively to the public or to transportation authorities. Commuters left for work on the morning of February 6 under the assumption that the approaching storm would be manageable. The meteorological conditions that would trap the region beneath snow and wind for 36 hours were developing offshore, measurable and observable, but not yet fully understood in their combined effect. The infrastructure stood ready for winter weather. It was not prepared for immobility. Snow began falling across eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island during the late morning hours of February 6th. Initially moderate, the precipitation intensified rapidly as the offshore low deepened and the wind increased. By early afternoon, snowfall rates reached 2 to 3 inches per hour across the coastal corridor from New Haven to Portland. The wind, blowing steadily from the northeast at 40 miles per hour with gusts to 60, drove the snow horizontally, eliminating visibility and sculpting drifts across any surface perpendicular to the wind. The sensory environment collapsed into whiteout. Visibility dropped below 100 feet on open roadways. The sound of traffic diminished, replaced by the steady rush of wind and the soft hiss of snow moving across pavement. Light failed to penetrate the density of falling and blowing snow. Vehicles became dim shapes visible only at close range. The boundary between road and shoulder disappeared beneath accumulation. Lane markings vanished. Drifts formed in minutes, piling against guardrails, filling highway medians and blocking intersections. Weather stations recorded snowfall totals that accumulated hour by hour. Boston received 27 inches. Providence recorded 28 inches. Worcester measured 32 inches. These figures represented total accumulation, but the critical factor was rate. The snow fell too quickly for removal efforts to keep pace. Wind speeds remained high throughout the day and into the night. Gusts reached 70 miles per hour along Cape Cod and the South Shore. The sustained wind created drifts 6 to 12 feet deep in areas where roads crossed open terrain or intersected perpendicular to the wind direction. Traffic on Interstate 95, Route 128, and the Massachusetts Turnpike slowed during the afternoon as visibility deteriorated and accumulation increased. Vehicles that continued moving found themselves in deepening snow with no clear path forward. Cars stalled in drifts. Trucks lost traction on inclines. Plows that had been deployed early became surrounded by vehicles and trapped by accumulation. Rail service on the MBTA and Amtrak lines faced delays as switches froze and drifts blocked tracks. Logan Airport closed before midday, with aircraft grounded and runways obscured. By evening, movement had ceased. Vehicles sat where they stopped on highway lanes, exit ramps, city streets. The storm continued without pause. Snow accumulated through the night. Wind maintained its speed and direction. The infrastructure designed for mobility had become a landscape of immobility, measured in feet of snow and miles of blocked corridor. The system had not collapsed. It had simply stopped. The transportation network that connected New England ceased to function during the afternoon and evening of February 6th. Interstate 95, the primary north-south corridor from Connecticut through Rhode Island and Massachusetts into New Hampshire, became impassable as drifts accumulated faster than clearing could be attempted. Route 128, the outer belt around Boston, held thousands of vehicles that could neither advance nor retreat. The Massachusetts Turnpike, normally maintained as a priority route, filled with abandoned cars between Worcester and Boston. Secondary routes and local roads disappeared beneath snow, shaped by wind into formations that obscured their original surface. The failure occurred systematically rather than suddenly. Traffic did not stop at once but slowed incrementally as conditions worsened. Vehicles attempting to continue found themselves in snow too deep to traverse. Cars stalled on inclines became obstacles that blocked lanes. Drivers who attempted to reverse or turn around found no space to maneuver. Within hours, major roadways contained thousands of stranded vehicles distributed along their length with no means of removal. Tow trucks could not reach them. Plows could not pass them. The roads became linear storage zones for machinery that had stopped functioning. Rail service ended as snow blocked tracks and electrical systems failed. The MBTA commuter rail lines that radiated from Boston to the suburbs lost power as overhead catenary lines iced or were damaged by wind. Snow drifted across tracks in cuts and open sections, accumulating faster than maintenance equipment could clear. Amtrak suspended service along the Northeast Corridor. Trains that had departed before the suspension were halted at stations or between stations, unable to proceed or return. Passengers remained aboard for hours in unheated or minimally heated cars. Logan Airport recorded its last departures before noon on February 6. Runways became unusable as visibility dropped and snow accumulated. Aircraft scheduled to arrive were diverted to airports outside the affected region. Passengers who had reached the terminal before the closure remained there, with no transportation available to leave. The terminal became a shelter by default. Other airports across the region, T.F. Green in Providence, Bradley in Hartford, closed under similar conditions. The network of scheduled air movement stopped completely. The sensory record of this failure was quiet and cold. Vehicles sat buried to their windows in drifts. Highway lanes became indistinguishable from shoulders. The sound of engines disappeared. Rail tracks lay empty and obscured. In cities, streets filled with snow that no traffic disturbed. The infrastructure had not been damaged, it had been rendered inaccessible. The systems that moved people and goods through the region had become static, held in place by snow and wind, awaiting conditions that would permit their eventual clearing and restoration. Movement had been replaced by stillness. Function had been replaced by waiting. Electrical failures began during the afternoon of February 6 as wind speeds exceeded design tolerances for distribution systems across eastern New England. Wooden utility poles carrying power lines through residential neighborhoods and along rural roads were vulnerable to both wind load and ice accumulation. Lines sagged under the weight of snow and ice, then broke or contacted each other as poles tilted or snapped. Transformers mounted on poles failed when lines fell or when wind drove snow into their housings. By evening, sections of the electrical grid serving coastal and suburban communities had lost power. The failures spread through the night. In some areas, entire neighborhoods went dark as primary distribution lines failed. In others, individual streets or blocks lost service as secondary lines broke. Utility crews attempting to assess damage found roads impassable and visibility too poor for safe work. The restoration process could not begin until the storm ended and access was restored. Homes that lost power cooled rapidly in temperatures that remained in the teens. Furnaces stopped. Water pipes in unheated spaces began to freeze. Residents gathered in rooms that retained heat longest or left for shelters if they could reach them. The coast experienced a compounding threat. The storm coincided with a new moon high tide on the evening of February 6. The low-pressure system generated a storm surge that raised water levels 3 to 5 feet above predicted tidal heights. Wind-driven waves traveled over seawalls and inundated coastal neighborhoods from Connecticut to Maine. In Revere, Massachusetts, water flooded streets 2 blocks inland from the beach. In Hull, waves damaged seawalls and pushed debris into intersections. In Scituate, homes on the waterfront sustained structural damage as waves struck at elevated levels sustained by the surge. Ice formed along the immediate shoreline where spray and surge water encountered sub-freezing air temperatures. Seawalls became coated with ice layers that built throughout the storm. Piers and pilings accumulated ice from repeated wave action. The combination of surge, waves, and ice damaged coastal infrastructure that had been designed for normal storm conditions, but not for this sustained and elevated assault. Substations serving coastal areas were inundated, causing additional power failures. Pumping stations that normally managed stormwater were submerged or lost electrical supply. Weather stations and tide gauges recorded the conditions precisely. Boston Harbor measured a storm surge of 4.8 feet above predicted tide. Wind gusts at the Blue Hill Observatory reached 92 miles per hour. Snow water equivalent measurements indicated moisture content consistent with heavy, dense snow. These figures documented a storm that delivered both atmospheric and oceanic impacts simultaneously across infrastructure, not designed to withstand their combination. The power failures and coastal damage occurred not as anomalies, but as predictable responses to forces that exceeded design thresholds. The systems did not fail in the sense of poor construction. They failed because the conditions surpassed what they had been built to resist. Clearing operations began in limited form on February 7th as wind speeds decreased and snowfall tapered. The storm did not end abruptly but gradually diminished through the morning, allowing visibility to improve from whiteout to several hundred feet. Plows that had been immobilized by traffic and drifts began moving along sections of roadway where abandoned vehicles had been pushed to shoulders, or where corridors had remained partially clear. The scale of the task became evident in daylight. Major highways held thousands of vehicles, many buried to their roofs. Urban streets were impassable. Drifts exceeding 10 feet blocked intersections and covered parked cars completely. Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis declared a state of emergency and instituted a ban on vehicle travel except for emergency personnel. The National Guard was activated to assist in snow removal and to transport stranded motorists and essential workers. Front-end loaders, dump trucks, and heavy equipment normally used in construction were deployed to clear roads. The priority system focused first on major highways and routes to hospitals, then on secondary roads and residential streets. In Boston, snow was loaded into trucks and hauled to designated dump sites because there was no space to pile it along narrow city streets. The sensory environment of the clearing effort was one of cold persistence. Diesel engines ran continuously. Exhaust vapor rose in the sub-freezing air. Loaders moved slowly through deep snow, filling truck beds that transported loads to waterfront areas or vacant lots. Metal blades scraped pavement that had not been visible for 2 days. The work proceeded in increments. One lane cleared, then widened, then expanded to allow two-way traffic. Intersections required manual clearing around abandoned vehicles and snow piles created by wind. Each corridor took hours or days depending on its width, traffic load, and drift depth. Rail lines required specialized equipment. Track-mounted snowblowers cleared drifts from cuts and open sections, where snow had piled 4 to 6 feet deep. Crews inspected catenary lines for damage and cleared ice from switches and signals. The MBTA restored limited commuter rail service by February 9th on sections where tracks had been cleared and power restored. Amtrak resumed service along the Northeast Corridor on February 10th after inspections confirmed structural integrity. Logan Airport reopened on February 8th after runways were cleared, and aircraft that had been snowed in were de-iced and repositioned. The clearing process extended into the second week following the storm. Residential streets in suburbs and smaller cities remained blocked for days after main routes were opened. Snow piles created by plowing narrowed lanes and obscured sightlines at intersections. The duration of the effort reflected both the volume of snow and the distribution of abandoned vehicles, which had to be towed before corridors could be fully cleared. Movement resumed gradually, corridor by corridor, as the infrastructure was excavated from beneath the accumulation that had stopped it. The storm ended on February 7th, leaving New England beneath record snowfall and facing a recovery process that would extend for weeks. Visibility returned as wind subsided and snow stopped falling. The landscape revealed itself slowly. Highways lined with abandoned vehicles, coastal neighborhoods inundated and ice-coated, power lines down across rural roads. Drifts settled but remained deep, sculpted into forms that marked the direction and duration of the wind. The immediate emergency transitioned into the prolonged task of restoration. Casualties from the storm totaled 54 deaths in Massachusetts, 29 in Rhode Island, and additional fatalities in Connecticut and other affected states. Causes included heart attacks during snow removal, carbon monoxide poisoning from improper heating, exposure, and traffic accidents during the storm's onset. Economic impact was estimated at $500 million in 1978 currency, accounting for property damage, business interruption, and the cost of clearing operations. Thousands of homes and businesses sustained damage from coastal flooding. Power outages affected more than 1 million customers, with some areas remaining without electricity for over a week. The recovery timeline varied by location and infrastructure type. Major highways reopened within 4 to 5 days. Residential streets in urban areas took a week or longer. Coastal communities required additional time to assess and repair structural damage to seawalls, piers, and waterfront buildings. Insurance claims took months to process. Businesses that had closed during the storm reopened as access was restored, though economic activity remained depressed for weeks as employees struggled to return to normal schedules. The storm prompted examination of emergency management systems and forecasting practices. Massachusetts revised its disaster response protocols, establishing clearer procedures for travel bans and coordination between state agencies and municipalities. Forecasting improvements focused on better communication of storm severity and on refining models for rapid intensification of coastal systems. Coastal planning in subsequent years incorporated higher design standards for seawalls and addressed vulnerabilities in low-lying neighborhoods, though implementation varied by municipality and available funding. Infrastructure adjustments proceeded gradually. Utility companies began programs to reinforce distribution systems and improve restoration capacity. Transportation agencies reviewed snow removal equipment inventories and response plans. Building codes in coastal areas incorporated flood provisions based on revised storm surge projections. These changes occurred incrementally over years rather than immediately, constrained by budget cycles and competing priorities. New England resumed its routines as roads cleared and systems restarted. Traffic returned to highways. Trains ran on schedule. Power was restored. The coast remained, its vulnerabilities documented and its infrastructure marked by an event that had tested limits and revealed thresholds. The landscape carried no permanent scar, but the records remained: snowfall totals, wind speeds, tide heights, casualties, costs. The blizzard of 1978 became a reference point, a measured event that had stopped movement and then allowed it to resume, leaving consequence in the form of reform, memory, and data.